At the start of this chapter, the prophet Elisha sends one of the young men from the company of prophets on a secret mission to anoint a new king in Israel. So he went to Ramoth Gilead, and when he arrived, he found the army officers sitting together. That would be an intimidating room to walk into, I imagine. "I have a message for you, Commander," he said. "For which of us?" asked Jehu. "For you, Commander," he replied. So he takes him aside, he anoints him as the next king, and then instructs him in all that he should do. Jehu goes back to his army buddies, and after a little hesitation, he says the following: "This is what the Lord says, I anoint you king over Israel." Now these men, to their credit, they immediately recognize the authority of this proclamation. Many would be filled with envy or jealousy at the thought of one of their peers being promoted above them, but not these guys. They spread their cloaks under him, and they blow trumpets, and they shout, "Jehu is king." Now Jehu, in an act of stunning courage and obedience, he rides to meet Joram, the current king. Just so happens that Ahaziah, the southern king, is hanging out with the northern king at the time when Jehu arrives. Why might that be? Well, because, as we mentioned in the previous chapter, these two kingdoms have now become intertwined, but in the worst possible way, through the intermarriage of Ahab's daughter with the southern king. Both kings are corrupt, and both ripe for judgment. The watchman, of course, sees this man on the horizon, and he gets an order from the king to send a rider out to go and meet this man. The horseman rode off to meet Jehu and said, "This is what the king says, do you come in peace?" "What do you have to do with peace?" Jehu replied. "Fall in behind me." Which is about the most epic response imaginable, isn't it? "If you are on the side of peace, then you ought to be on my side, ride with me." Amazing. The lookout on the walls of the city is a bit confused by this. He tells the king the messenger has reached him, but he isn't coming back. And so the king sends out a second horseman, and exactly the same thing happens. Well, Jehu is now near enough that the lookout is able to recognize him. He says the driving, that is, of the chariot, is like that of Jehu. He drives like a maniac, which is kind of hilarious, isn't it? I know one or two people who drive like Jehu myself. So the king rides out to meet the messenger himself, not realizing, of course, that he is about to meet not just the messenger, but his maker. "Have you come in peace, Jehu?" the northern king asks. "How can there be peace?" Jehu replied, "as long as all the idolatry and witchcraft of your mother Jezebel abound?" Well, Joram understands what is about to happen first, and he calls out to his nephew, the other king, "Treachery, Ahaziah!" They both turn to flee, but Jehu draws his bow, shoots Joram between the shoulders, presumably through the back, which kills him. And he orders the chariot officer to pick him up and throw him on the field that once belonged to Naboth. There's some poetic justice in there, isn't there? So when Ahaziah, king of Judah, saw what had happened, he fled. But Jehu called for his execution, and his men finished the job. There is one last execution that Jehu is determined to enact in this chapter. It is the woman who caused so much of this confusion and corruption in the first place, the one who corrupted Ahab in the north. She has been the source of so much sin and misery. It is, of course, Jezebel. Jehu went to Jezreel. When Jezebel heard about it, she put on eye makeup, arranged her hair, and looked out of the window. Listen to this inglorious end for a woman who was so saturated with sin. Jehu is not even the one to kill her. He simply calls up to the attendants who are in the room with her, "Who is on my side? Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs look down at him. Imagine the eunuchs peering down at him. Who is this man? Well, something of the significance of this moment dawns on the men. Jehu is clearing out the evil house of Ahab, and these men have worked for Jezebel. They've seen her up close and personal. They see the opportunity to get rid of her once and for all, and face no consequences for doing so, since both the northern and southern kings have now been killed. "Throw her down," Jehu said. So they threw her down, and some of her blood spattered the wall and the horses as they trampled her underfoot. If you thought that was gory, just be aware that we've not finished the chapter yet. Jehu went in and ate and drank. "Take care of that cursed woman," he said, "and bury her, for she was a king's daughter." But, we read, when they went out to bury her, they found nothing except her skull, her feet, and her hands. They went back and told Jehu, who said, "This is the word of the Lord that he spoke through his servant Elijah the Tishbite. On the plot of ground at Jezreel, Dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh. Jezebel's body will be like dung on the ground in the plot at Jezreel, so that no one will be able to say, 'This is Jezebel.'" And to think that she'd just done her makeup as well. She made an effort here to paint over her imperfections, to appear outwardly beautiful, but she was rotten on the inside all the way through. What a devastating ending to the story of Jezebel. But given the evil that she unleashed, it is a warning to us, isn't it? That rejecting the living God, refusing to obey, and opting instead for idolatry at every turn, it will only end one way, and it is not a pretty picture. It ends with the decisive, undeniable, irreversible judgment landing full force upon you. This is the fate of those who serve themselves and those who stand up in ongoing defiance against the one true God.